Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second day of this conference. I can see the energy levels are high. It is indeed my pleasure and privilege to introduce to you this morning Professor Guy Standing. Guy Standing is Professor of Development Studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies at the University of London and a founder member and co-president of the Basic Income Earth Network, an NGO promoting basic income as a right. He has held chairs at the University of Bath and Monash and was previously director of the Socio-Economic Security Program of the International Labour Organization. He's published two books. The first one, The Work After Globalization, and the second one, The Precariat. I know the Precariat is available for sale from Cedric outside there at Adams. I read a few chapters of The Precariat last night, and introduces the concept of the precarious proletariat, and I found the analysis quite intriguing. He draws insights from powerful thinkers like Michel Foucault, Pierre Bourdieu, Hannah Arendt, and Antonio Negri. So I'm looking forward to what he has to say this morning. I think it's important, before we invite Professor Standing to the podium, to very briefly touch on the socio-economic context in South Africa. We know that South Africa has amongst the highest, one of the highest income inequality indices in the world. The Gini coefficient stands at about 6.7%. And incidentally, after listening to yesterday morning's talk about South African academics earning the third highest salaries in the world, some of you academics are partly responsible for this embarrassingly high Gini coefficient. You got that, Prof. Samuel? Okay. When I sat there yesterday morning, I suddenly felt so much richer. Yeah. Okay. Coming back to the South African context, unemployment has been consistently at about 35% for the last 3 decades. Close to 40% of the population live below the poverty line. And ironically, I learned last week that Johann Rupert paid 30 million rands for a single buffalo, named a mystery, incidentally. So we have a problem. The anger of the precarious proletariat is simmering. The Marikana disaster, where 32 miners perished recently, is what Pillay refers to as the tragedy of racial capitalism, where neoliberal agendas and the power elite, the disciplinary power of capital, and a powerful state apparatus in the form of the security force work in concert to maintain the status quo. This is the recipe for what Guy Standing refers to as the politics of inferno. With that, I'd like to welcome and call Prof. Standing to the podium. Prof, we look forward to your talk this morning.
Can you give me the copy of this? Thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be back in Durban. To fill in a couple of details, I wish it were the only 2 books I've written. I've written rather a lot of others. And one of them was on restructuring the South African labour market. I had been briefing members of the ANC when in exile and never come to South Africa, but after the President Mandela government took office, I had the great privilege of being invited to be Director of Research of the Presidential Labour Market Commission in 1995-96, and we wrote a thick volume. And it was a fantastic experience working with many academics, many practitioners, and so on. And we produced this report, and I was invited to present it to the full cabinet in Cape Town, with Thabo Mbeki in the chair, all the cabinet ministers there. And it happened to be on the same day that GEAR, those of you who are South Africans will know about GEAR, others may as well, was presented to the cabinet. So we had in the one afternoon session, I was talking and Trevor Manuel was presenting GEAR. Now, I argued that it was fundamentally important that there should be a restructuring and a redistribution of income and wealth and power before any further developmental policies were developed. Geer argued the opposite. Geer argued you must go for flexibility, you must go for full liberalization. And I said at the time, and it's on record, so I'm quite happy to say it again, I said, if you follow this course, inequalities will grow compared with apartheid era. And your high unemployment, which is not 40%, but 20-something% in real terms, I believe, but is still chronically high, and the poverty will continue and get worse until you have more social violence of a different type. It gives me great pain to come back to South Africa regularly, as I have done since, and see a deterioration rather than the great hopes that President Mandela had when he took office. Now, the talk I'm going to give is an attempt, as an economist, to link some rather different phenomena and give a perspective of what I think has been happening in the international labor market through globalization, through the class fragmentation that's been taking place, and through the process of educational commodification, which has been a common theme across the world. And I'd like to begin by quoting, I'm sure most of you are familiar with it, a statement made by John Stuart Mill when he was made rector of St. Andrews University in 1867. And I think it's very pertinent for where we are today, so I hope you don't mind if I read it out. He said in his speech, "At least there is a tolerably general agreement about what a university is not. It is not a place of professional education. Universities are not intended to teach the knowledge required to fit men for some special mode of gaining their livelihood. The object is not to make skilled lawyers or physicians or engineers, but capable and cultivated human beings. Men are men before they are lawyers or physicians or merchants or manufacturers. And if you make them capable and sensible men, they will make themselves capable and sensible lawyers or physicians." That great statement of what a university should be is somehow lost in today's world. The second reference point I'd like to make is from Hegel. And Hegel said the great mission of education is the art of making men ethical. Now, with globalization, the triumph of neoliberalism in the 1980s, essentially, and you can dress it up in various other ways, essentially advocated the liberalization of all markets and the commodification of everything that could be commodified, made subject to market forces, and sold and bought. And a key part of the neoliberal project of Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek, and all the sages, including many who've gone on to get Nobel Prizes in economics, was systematic dismantling of institutions of social solidarity and reciprocity that stood against the market. It's very important to know that that is part of the neoliberal ethos, because institutions that stand against the market make for inefficiencies and various other things. Now, what's happened with liberalization, and the contextual point I want to make and then leave it aside, is that effectively we opened up to a globalizing labor market. And in a twinkle, historically speaking, the world's labor supply was trebled. An extra 2 billion people became part of the global labor market. And the extra 2 billion, mainly from India and China and Indonesia and other emerging market economies, were all habituated and resigned to working for 1/50th of what anybody in an OECD country could expect, and maybe 1/30th of what a South African worker might have expected. So, of course, you have immediate downward pressure on wages across the world and a whole process of recommodification of labor facilitated by the weak bargaining position of working people. Now, in that process, what has happened is a globalizing class structure has been emerging superimposed on old national class structures. Now, you can't reproduce the exact contours of this emerging class structure on any particular economy, but in general, what has been happening is roughly what I'm going to describe. And I hope you will bear with me. I have to be brief. Effectively, what's happened is we have a plutocracy. I was very touched when Noam Chomsky wrote to me when he read my book and has endorsed it because he wanted me to use the term plutocracy. A plutocracy at the top of super citizens, off in the stratosphere, many criminals with their multi-billions. We know most of their names. We wish we didn't. But they have enormous influence and power. Below them is an elite trying to reach the plutocracy, equally mired in criminality and lack of ethics, a point to which I will return. And alongside them are the growing number of what I call professions, consultants, people who don't want employment security, gadding around the world, selling their gadgets, their buzzwords, their electronic wizardry, and so on. They're making a lot of money. Their only problem is burnout at age 31 and a half. Below that is the old core proletariat, the old proletarianized workforce for which the pro-welfare states of the 20th century were built, and all the labor regulations for them were built with them in mind. Now, they're shrinking everywhere, everywhere. If I go to China, they're shrinking there just as much as they are in Britain or the United States. And it's below them that the precariat is emerging. With respect, it's not a proletarianized group. It's separate from the proletariat. It is an emerging class, and why I call the book the new dangerous class, I'll come to in a minute, but it is a distinctive group that's emerging across the world. And very briefly, you can characterize the precariat as having distinctive relations of production, if you want to use a Marxian notion, the relations of production in which they are distanced from full-time, stable employment and are being habituated to a life of unstable labor and unstable living. This sense of which flexibility is meaning that they have to adapt and constantly retune themselves and reorient their own behavior alongside it. Now, the precariat in this respect has to do an incredibly large amount of work that is not labor. Work for labor. They have to retrain themselves, they have to prepare, they have to network more, they have to deal with the state, they have to learn this, relearn that, learn something else. And this induces what I've called a precariatized mind. If there's anybody in this room who's avoided having this particular problem, they should patent their solution because they'll make themselves very wealthy. Because we're all suffering from the precariatized mind, flitting between activities, not sure what is the thing that we need to do that's most likely to lead to nirvana. And therefore constantly switching on the emails or the Twitter or whatever it is, our particular medicine. You know the feeling? Yes. Now, the precariatized mind has gone along with something which has been given too little emphasis, and I would just put it out there for your reflection. That part of the neoliberal agenda was the systematic dismantling of occupational communities, the great guild traditions of the professions and the crafts, in which learning of the ethics and the culture of occupations was passed on from generation to generation. And that learning took place in the process of developing your capabilities. The second aspect of the precariat is distinctive relations of distribution. What this means is that the social income of any individual has been restructured in the direction of having to rely very much on money wages. The precariat doesn't have access to enterprise benefits like pensions, medical insurance, paid holidays, and that sort of thing, and has to rely on wages that are more insecure, lower, and volatile. So a feature of the precariat is almost chronic indebtedness and being on the edge of falling into an abyss. And this, of course, makes it very difficult to develop a sense of career, a sense of fulfillment in life, which is a real existential crisis. The third feature of the precariat is that it has distinctive relations to the state, not necessarily to governments, to the state. And what this means is, for the first time in history, governments and agencies of the state are turning more and more people into what I call denizens rather than citizens. A denizen is an ancient concept about somebody entering a place and being given fewer rights than the citizen. And we are seeing people losing rights, losing cultural rights, civil rights, political rights, social and economic rights. And you can see this process, or millions more people are being shifted into this status. And the next feature of the precariat is a distinct consciousness, a consciousness of loss, a consciousness of frustration and relative deprivation. And in this respect, why the precariat is today the dangerous class is because there are three varieties inside the precariat around the world. The first variety consists mainly of relatively uneducated people falling out of old working class communities. Their father or mother had certain occupations. They were dockers, they were miners, they were shipbuilders, they were whatever. But they don't have any sense of occupational career to build, no occupational narrative to give to their lives. But not having the education, they are easily swayed by the sirens of populism, easily lured to agendas of neo-fascism. My predicament is the fault of the other, the migrant, the black, the white, whatever the group that you want to demonize. And that group is turning to neo-fascist political agendas around the world. The second group consists of the denizens, the migrants, the minorities, the disabled, the women in many places, who just have to keep their heads down because they've got to survive. These people are tending to be politically detached because they haven't had the public education and the capacity to participate in the life of the polis, in public life. But every now and then, when some particular event happens that affects them very directly, they turn to days of rage and lash out. We've seen this around the world. And the third group, third variety of precariat, consists of those people who've been going all the way through the educational process. And they are emerging without any sense of career in front of them. And they are experiencing incredible status frustration. Whereas the first group is suffering from having no sense of the past, the second group having no sense of the present, this third group has no sense of the future. And this creates another type of existential crisis. And there was a beautiful piece of graffiti that I read on the wall of Madrid, where the indignados are essentially representing the Precariat in Spain. And the piece of graffiti said, the worst thing would be to return to the old normal. It's a very subversive piece of graffiti. I loved it, because it's essentially showing that, in fact, this educated generation and others, older people who have the same sense of feelings, don't want to go back to the laborism of the past. They don't want full-time, stable jobs stretching for 30 years. They want to work on their enthusiasms. They want to be creative human beings. They want to have life in the polis, and so on. And this makes them a very dangerous group, because they are rejecting old-style politics and are looking for another type of politics that will be emancipatory and enable them to return as moral citizens. Now, in the light of what is happening in terms of the class fragmentation, what role has education played? I think the situation is pretty dire, if I'm honest. I have the great privilege, because of these books, to be invited to many universities, and I have many, many, many academic friends, partly as a result. And I think the malaise is universal. We have experienced a process of educational commodification in the last 30 years, where we've seen a new modern form of streaming. The elite, the plutocracy, and those from the salariat who've got money enough can buy themselves the traditional liberating, enlightenment education. They can go to the great universities and wallow at the seats of the great and the good in the educational community. But they are a tiny minority. For the majority, and particularly for the Precariat, we have seen the emphasis on human capital. Human capital, which means that you must make yourself more and more competitive with everybody else. And in doing so, we have seen 5 main commodities being produced by the education system. The first commodity are called degrees and diplomas and certificates. We must maximize the number of certificates. I am very delighted to hear that even our organizer is subjecting us to producing more certificates, evaluating ourselves and our feeble performances in front of large audiences. It's very humbling, but I think it's the sign of the times. We are suffering from an epidemic of credentialism. Recently, a friend of mine in the United States of Princeton, he did a survey and he said there was one application, one job, standard job of an engineer in a company, and they had 25,000 applicants, all submitting their resumes and so on. And I dare say you might guess what happened. All 25,000 were rejected because their particular certificates and particular experience didn't match the algorithm that was being used. So what we're seeing is a selling of lottery tickets. And the lottery tickets are costing more and more and are worth less and less, because more and more people are being sold this commodity. We're maximizing the education industry and channeling incredible numbers through the system. And we're producing a loss of what Aristotle called paideia, deep critical thinking. Deep critical thinking because you haven't got the time. You've got to process, get through, get these rote exams done, tick the right boxes. And I think this is the commodity that we have to fight. The second commodity, which flows from the first, are called graduates. You may have heard of them. We have to maximize their number. There was a professor at a university, I will not name him, I know him, at a university who had the audacity to fail 2 students. The dean called him in and said, "Look, Jim, you can't fail students." He said, "Why not? They were useless." He said, "No, you can't do that. You can give them deferred success, but not failure, because it will do the reputation of the university no good, and it will put off people applying to come to our university." He said, no, I'm sorry, but look, I'm a professor, and they weren't any good. I don't think they did the work. I'm failed. Jim, go away for the weekend. Think about it. I'll talk to you on Monday. Monday he came in. "Jim, have a cup of coffee. What's your decision?" "I'm sorry, I still fail." "Well, the VC would like to see you." This is a true story. We laugh, but of course we laugh. The VC said, "Look, you must change your mind." He said, "I'm sorry, but they failed." "Well, you hand in your notice this afternoon. You're out of a job." He took the university to court. He won damages, but he did not get his job back. Now, we're getting to the stage where we're trying to maximize the throughputs. We're dumbing down too much. We all know these tendencies. It's nothing novel there. But it's a real part of the total crisis. The third commodity which we're producing is called academics. We must produce, mass produce academics, and there is a class structure that is very similar to the emerging class structure within the academic community. So you have your superstar elite making megabucks with their bonuses, and they are subject to transfer fees that almost equal footballers' transfer fees. I know one professor quite well who's got a Nobel Prize, but he's paid $250,000 by one university, and all he has to do is turn up once a year. But his name adds to the next commodity. Now, at the same time as you're getting an elite, you have a salariat who's making these very nice salaries with employment security, tenure, and so on. But the growing number of people are in the educational precariat as adjuncts, auxiliaries, and we are fundamentally letting these people down. In many American universities today, the adjuncts, the precariat part of faculty, is the majority now. And they are being paid pittance. They are on standby. They can be shifted courses. It's stressful. They've got 0-hour contracts or whatever the name might be in different places. And within the community of education, the more senior are letting them down because they are not standing up with a solidarity ethos for them. But the emphasis on academics as commodities leads, of course, to the grading of courses and universities and league tables. So we all have to rush around filling in forms, trying to prove that we're making a major impact. We are just in Britain suffering from the research excellence framework. Now, for those of you who have the displeasure of knowing anything about this sort of thing, and I know it's happening everywhere else, will know very well that we're behaving like Pavlovian dogs, rushing around trying to prove how wonderful we are and what great impact we're making. This is really petty behavior, unworthy of an educated, civilized person. Now, the final commodity, of course, are the universities themselves, universities and colleges. We are branding universities around the world. If you go to many countries, you will find universities all trying to peddle their products, tell people why they should come to their universities, take their courses, go online. And again, you see the administrators taking over, selling, selling, selling. We're not seeing just brands of the great universities, but also online universities and teacherless universities, which are spreading and being monopolized by major multinational corporations. And the final commodity is that standardized teaching, the online courses provided by global superstars, which are sadly being sold around the world, teaching rote teaching without critical faculties. Now, I've been brief because I haven't any more time. 2 minutes? And I'd like to conclude by saying a few things what should be done. I think we have to recreate the educational community and fight against the commodifying trends. And this is particularly important for those of us who are, shall we put it, towards the end of a career, because we should have more courage in fighting these tendencies. It's very difficult for the young adjunct lecturer, desperate for a 6-month contract, to have the courage to oppose this. But we should be using satire, we should be using our available intellectual tools to fight this process. And there is one area which I think we need to struggle to refocus and reintegrate into the mainstream of education. And that is moral education. The ethics of living, which has been crowded out by the commodifying tendencies. You can't get jobs if you know a lot about philosophy or ethics. I know in several universities that have closed their philosophy departments because the rate of return is too low. We should be fighting for the return of moral education to the center of education. We must fight these grading systems. We must fight against the commodification and privatization. And that means, in particular, fighting for educationalists, all the great sciences and arts, to be represented on the boards and governance structures of all universities and colleges and schools, rather than letting the administrators, the accountants, the profiteers dominate. We should be demanding a restructuring so that the voice of the precariat part of the educational system is also integrated into the governance structures. And we should be struggling to reduce the differentiation that's taking place within faculties and the educational community. It's a shame on all of us that this has been happening. And finally, we must restore the right to education, the right to a real education for education's sake, for the sake of the John Stuart Mill's great rallying cry of the 19th century. The right to education is not the right to prepare yourself to be competitive in the job market. A right to an education is to be able to be culturally richer and to be able to participate and to be able to work on your enthusiasms and care for your community, your neighbors, your relatives. This enriching part of education has been denuded, and we should be fighting to restore it. I hope that we will do that But I know that the younger generation who are emerging with this status frustration that are taking to the streets and squares around the world, in Turkey recently, in Brazil recently, in Spain, in Italy, and in many other parts of the world, they know that that part is most critical. They want a right to education. And I think all of us should subscribe to that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Guy. I'm not going to attempt to crystallize this talk, but I could hear that many of you could identify with some of your conceptualizations, and we could see it happening at our university. Incidentally, there's a space on our university council if you're available. I think we need your insights there. The floor is now open to questions. I want to urge you to be as succinct as possible. Please don't set up an elaborate context before you pose your question. Be very direct and clear. Let's try and get as many questions as possible. So the floor is open. The mics they are roving mics.
Thank you, Professor Standing. I must say I really enjoyed your talk, and it has stimulated me very much. The question I would like to raise is what kind of balance, because we need to pay the bills at the end of the day. What kind of balance do we need between paying the bills and becoming a moral and upright citizen in the community?
You want to take 3 or 4?
Prof is happy to take 3 or 4 questions at a time. Just go ahead, Salim.
Thanks. Guy, fascinating as usual. I'm trying to wrestle with the idea of the precariat. We are clearly educating for the precariat. So how do we begin to unpack the nature, the very structures of our education? So we training for medicine, or we're training to become a lawyer, but there clearly are no jobs there. How do we begin to change our system so that we begin to see this new reality? Because that's what it is. I mean, it can't be dangerous anymore. The reality is that we need to begin to start training for it. Thanks.
We'll take one more question.
If there is one.
If there is one, all right, we'll go with those 2 for now. Okay.
I mean, most academics are very privileged people if they've been in the community for some time. They can pay their bills. They have a very privileged lifestyle relative to the millions in the precariat. And one's not pleading for impoverishment. One is pleading for greater respect for integrity, which is why we are educated people in the first place. And I think we should be frowning on the commodification of superstars in the profession. I think it is obscene when you are using part of the university resources to pay for superstars that barely turn up, and if they do, they're rushing to the airport as quickly as possible. I think it's perfectly consistent to have decent salaries, but I think that it's attendant on all of us to be fighting for the adjunct part of the educational community, because they can't teach properly, they cannot learn their own skills and impart those things unless they have basic security and feel that they are building a career and imparting something that is part of them. So I think it's perfectly consistent. We must reduce the differentiation and the class differentiation that's taking place. Now, I think the second question is such a big one that I can't do it justice, so I apologize in advance. But I think one of the interesting things is that why the precariat is a dangerous class is that it's transformative. It's rejecting old agendas, and it's faced with being victims, but also has a bohemian streak. And it wants to become intuitively, and you can see this in all the precariat meetings I'm addressing, I find, that it's trying to move to the stage of becoming a class for itself. And a class for itself means putting its political and social agenda in the mainstream of discussions. And it's not the old socialist project of 100 years ago. The Precariat is looking for control over the key assets of modern tertiary society emerging, and is wanting to get control of things like time. There is no sense of control of time if you're in the Precariat. You're at the whim of a whole lot of things. We need redistribution of securities. That's why I support a basic income, so that people have a sense of basic security in which they can develop themselves in formal and informal ways of learning. You can't do that if you're at the whim of the market. And the irony is that the Precariat, in becoming a class for itself, is truly transformative, and I think this is happening. I won't go into that, in the sense it wants to abolish itself. That makes it very unique. And I think that the Precariat increasingly will demand a restructuring of the educational system and will mock it to the point where even the commodifiers in governments will have to do something about it. But we can help by pushing that.
Let's take another round of questions. As we'll take another round of questions. Go ahead, Andrew.
Right, morning. Thank you very much. I really enjoyed your talk. To a certain extent, though, isn't this kind of like pie in the sky? You know, we have a whole lot of graduates who are unable to get jobs, and at the end of the time, people want some sort of education that takes them somewhere. So it's all very well to be enriched in your thinking and contribute great to academic discussions, but if I can't go out of here and actually find meaningful employment, then it kind of defeats, you know, I'm still a poor person struggling away. And so the balance between enriching your minds and actually giving skills so people can go and be a lawyer, be whatever within the market force.
Thank you. Thank you. We can take two more questions. Michael? Michael and then Sajida.
Thank you very much. I'm trying to understand the danger of this Precariat class, if they're a class of their own. Could the Precariat also be rather superficial, flimsy, and not deal with the agenda of what you're talking about, deep, sustainable change? Could they become commodities themselves and superficial, and therefore negate the very agenda that you're trying to establish in a social justice framing?
Thank you, Michael. Saj?
I feel very inspired this morning because I've been doing some research on the experiences of women academics in universities in this context of globalization and higher education reform. And it's been very, very depressing. But in terms of what you say about challenging the emergence of this class structure that's emerging in higher education, it takes us back to what we in South Africa have experienced as the tension between the goals of equity and the goals of development, which you alluded to right at the beginning when you talked about the shift from RDP to GEAR. And that is a critical issue. One of the things you said in terms of us fighting against what is happening, the neoliberal globalization of higher education, the commodification of education, and everything else that you've spoken about, it goes back to that. Because at the end of the day, when I sit in a meeting with my line manager, who is Murthy, he tells me, there's no money. I'm sorry, there's no money. That's what we've been told to tell you. So this information gets filtered down, and I was saying to Murthy last week that what has happened is middle managers like him have become, what was the word I used?
Commodifiers.
Commodifiers. Custodians of the bureaucratization of higher education. They're not academic leaders. So it goes back to that tension. And it's interesting that in 1993, Salim Badat and Harold Warp at the time were in the education policy unit at the University of Western Cape, and they wrote a paper about this tension, which in the initial policy document said we can do it. But obviously we can't.
All right. Thanks for such. It was more a comment, eh?
No.
Okay, but you can respond. We have three. You want to go for it?
Yeah. Let me hope I got the gist of the questions. I think pie in the sky. I think one has to have pie in the sky and be vaguely utopian, especially if you're giving a keynote where you wish to stir the cockles, as it were. But I think this status frustration that I'm talking about is partly to do with the feeling by millions of ex-students that they were sold a fraudulent commodity. Many of them come out of university saying, look, my parents or I have paid a lot of money for this, supposedly to prepare me for a job, but I'm neither prepared for a job nor educated. That's the reality we've got to confront. And I think no one is being stupidly idealistic. Of course, the education system has to give people the tools with which they can go through life, and that includes getting jobs. It's the balance that has gone all wrong because of this commodification tendency. And I think it's attendant on us to fight that trend. We won't win completely, of course not, but we should be fighting it much more bravely than we have done. Now, the fact is that going to education for millions of people is a shortcut route to lifetime debt. More and more people around the world are coming out of the university experience with debt that stretches into the never, never. In the United States, this has become absolutely frightening, and people can go on for 20 years and they're still trying to pay off the accumulation of their student debts. Now, we don't have to have a system which produces this. It's not necessary. Now, the dangerous class point, you're absolutely right. For the same reasons I've just been saying, we are tending to produce a dumbing down, commodifying educational system which is supposedly preparing people for jobs. And they enter the labor market and then they find that the few skills they learned are obsolescent because all restructuring is taking place, so they have to do some more retraining. More profits are made by some educational whiz kid selling courses, and the process goes on. And we have a responsibility as educationalists for some of that dumbing down that's taking place. And it's part of the reason why you're seeing such political detachment by the young. They aren't getting the civic education, the civic values, and the sense of culture reproduced through the education they're exposed to. Now, the last comment from the back, I can only say I agree with the gist of it. But of course, when they say no money, what they mean is that we've used the money for other purposes. And we must challenge those priorities more. You know, more glossy structures, more handouts, more selling of our products around the world, whatever it is, more paying our superstars, more buying online courses, more glossy presentations. So there are always priorities. And I think the only way we can really tackle that and oppose the gear tendency, if you like, is governance reform, and getting the voice of precariat teachers, the students, the different faculties involved in the governance so that your administrators, your white boys who are trying to make the university a profit center are at least put on the defensive and confronted by educational voices to a greater extent. And I just think, again, it goes back to this balance which we need to redress. Thank you.
Okay, guys, we have time for one more round of questions.
Pity.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Thanks. Thanks. My name is Sipelo Nwangu from Wits University. I found it quite interesting that you kind of in passing, you commented on excellence, which is a big word in universities, which is, by the way, also part of the schema that Bill Readings uses in his well-known book, The University in Ruins, where he draws the schema that we moved from what he calls the University of Culture, the founding university, to an interceding period that he calls the University of Reason, linked to the Enlightenment notion of truth, and the current period that he describes as driven by the idea of excellence, which is uncontested. I just thought you could maybe comment a bit more on that. My second question is that, what does this whole theorization of the precariat mean for our theorization of labor power?
Okay, thank you.
Given that...
I'm going to stop you there,
okay,
right? We got the question. Okay.
Big one.
Any further questions? Because we're just reaching 10 o'clock right now. All right, we'll stay with... Oh, you have one. We'll take the last question.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Stand up. My name is Rita Kizita from UWC. I just want to ask one question. Don't you think it's in the interests of the universities to keep the precariat where they are? Because they benefit. I mean, they assist the academic, because they assist the academic in doing their work so the academic can produce, as long as they are kept underwater, and are not given the social benefits.
Shall I answer? Well, thank you. Those two excellent questions to end up with. I'm not sure I would subscribe to that particular dichotomy of the university, because I think we've got even worse outcomes than that suggests. Because we've really almost got an anti-intellectualism that is a powerful part of modern academia. Courses are not so much good or bad by being scientific, but whether they sell. So you have a whole lot of pseudo courses taught at universities around the world, hundreds and hundreds of these courses. I mentioned some in the first book, which are completely unfounded in terms of any scientific relevance or truth. It's whether they sell. And so we're almost having a stream that is teaching people unreason. And I think that's a very dangerous trend, and it's partly the reflection of the loss of control by the great and the good of the educational community. And that leads to the second part. I can't answer it at length, but if we like to talk about it, but it's fundamentally important about the theorization of labor power. Now, I believe that in the 21st century, we're going to have a new system of distribution of income that'll be quite different from the 20th century, where wages will not be necessarily the main mechanism by which people gain income security and control of their lives. And I strongly believe in a basic income as part of that agenda, which means, in effect, decommodification of labor power, decommodification of you and me as human beings, so that we have basic security in which to pursue the great goals, which include education and developing our capabilities on caring for our families or whatever. And I think that the decommodification of labor power can go along with the commodification of labor. I should treat my job as instrumental. If I can treat my job as instrumental, it's much less stressful. I don't expect my happiness, my creativity to come from my job. I do it because I need the money. And that leads to the last question, which is, I hope, a very provocative one rather than a statement of belief. That's precisely the problem. If you have a community that reproduces itself and allows the elite and the salariat to earn the rental income because we're underpaying the precariat, and that they bear all the risks and the uncertainties, In a certain way, it reproduces itself, but it doesn't reproduce the educational community. And I think that that is far more important in the long term. The ethos and the ethics of education depend on us reducing the differentiation. To have a huge number of young lecturers scampering around, worrying if they're going to be able to pay the bill this week, let alone a longer term, is not conducive to a decent community or an educational community. And I think we have to fight that, even though it means some losses by the salariat and the upper echelons in terms of income gains. But if you're going to go into retirement later, you should be able to look back and say, at least I kept my integrity in my profession. And that's very important. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Professor Standing. It's always fascinating to listen to an academic activist at work. And we found your talk very, very inspiring. We have a special gift for you, a small token of our appreciation. And enclosed is a certificate of participation. Thank you very much, guys.